mute, we'd really appreciate it. And just as we're settling in, take a look at the screen. We'd love to hear how you're showing up today. So if you could share
Actually kind of scared me a little bit.
or a word or two to describe how you are doing today, we'd love to hear from you. And we're going to have a live transcript. All right. Let's see if I can get one of my colleagues. I know someone is recording already. For our closed caption, are we just doing live transcript? Should that work? Okay. All right. All right, again, we're just waiting for a few more people to join us, but for the time being, if you could just say hi in the chat, let us know who's here and what school or district you're coming from. We'd also love to know how you're showing up to today's session. We also have a note catcher for today, which my colleague Margaret Bruce has put in the chat. So please make sure that you're able to access that for today. I'll take about one more minute. Optimistic, great to hear that. Optimistic and excited. We're glad to have you here, Joshua and Joanne and everyone who's joined us today. Let's see. Welcome, Kara and Michelle. Great. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're still waiting for a few more people, but that's fine. We'll be able to catch them up as we go. So once again, if you can just make sure you're able to open the link in the chat, that's our handout for today. So welcome everyone. My name is Irene Teskey and I'm a senior manager here at TNTP. And I'm going to be facilitating your session today with my colleague, Tabitha. Tabitha, do you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Definitely. Hi, everyone. My name is Tabitha. I'm a director in the consulting division here at TNTP. And I'm a former math teacher and math school leader. So I'm excited to be talking about math specifically today. And I'm based in New York.
Great. Thanks, Tabitha. And so let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to our first session of our Drop-in School Leader PD learning series on learning acceleration. That's a very long title, just knows that we have. In any case, today we'll be focusing on how we can ensure students have access to grade appropriate assignments in math. But before we dive into our learning for today, we're just going to spend a few minutes connecting and orienting ourselves to how we'll be spending our time together this afternoon. So first, we just wanted to congratulate and thank you all for making the time for yourselves during what we're sure is a very busy day and busy week to be present with us. We know it's not easy to shut your office door and stop being fully present at school to participate. So again, we thank you for being here and appreciate your time. And with that, we want to share also some values and shared norms that we'd like to embrace today. So please just take a moment and read the ones in yellow and chat one that you would like to keep front of mind today. Thanks for getting us started, Joshua. Great, so I'm seeing some practice, not perfection. That's really going to be important to keep front of mind today as we go through some of the tools that we're going to be sharing today that may be new for you, but that we know will help improve learning acceleration and instructional practice at your school. So thank you very much for your participation there. We also have a few virtual norms that we'd like for you to keep in mind. This is a very interactive session. If you've been to our sessions before, you know we love to see you all participating in the chat and breakout groups. So as much as you're able to do that and to be on video, we really appreciate it. If you're unable to be on video, we understand, and just engage in the way you feel most comfortable. When we're in the whole group, we tend to remain on mute. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And if you need to step away for any reason, please try to not do so during the breakouts, because that's really our chance to collaborate with one another. And then finally, if you have a question, like you need a link to the handout again or something very specific, please direct message my colleague, Margaret Bruce. She'll be able to answer your question much more quickly than Tabitha or I. So a little bit about our partnership. TNTP and DESE have partnered on several initiatives in the past. And for this initiative, we closely collaborated and heard from a wide breadth of stakeholders to ensure that the roadmaps are aligned to the unique needs of students across the Commonwealth. And also we wanted to be sure to include existing tools and resources that are currently provided by DESE. So the roadmap, in case it's still new to you, it's organized in, around 3 overarching priorities, which are grounded in research that we know will support learning acceleration for students. Each priority is designed to create equitable experiences and outcomes for all of your students in a manner that's affirming of their race, identity, home language, and unique abilities. And today our learning will highlight critical practices around the third priority of ensuring strong, grade appropriate instruction. So going into this next school year, we know that all students we have probably seen at this point are all facing challenges related to unfinished learning and will require different types of supports. With that said, we also know that regardless of the type of support students need, they must receive access to grade level instruction. So today is all about understanding how to provide the opportunity of grade level assignments and one way to provide support to access them. So on your screen, you see 3 questions that will guide our learning for today and that we plan to answer. So please just take a moment to read those 3 silently to yourselves, please. So I wanted to also pause for a quick moment before we go into our first section, just to be fully transparent here in sharing that I know for some of you, some of the information that you hear today may be familiar to you, or you may have heard some of it in some parts before. This is by design. So our hope is that you will be able to take the information and materials that you see today back to your schools. So while some of the concepts may be familiar, this is a chance to deepen your understanding and also to borrow some of the language or training strategies that we use and apply those to how you're supporting educators in your building. So let's go ahead and get started with our first learning objective for today. Why is providing grade appropriate assignments critical to accelerating learning for all students? So we're going to do a quick grounding just to make sure we're operating from a common understanding. If you could, please quickly chat a few words that you associate with accelerated learning. Great, thanks, Stacy. Just-in-time supports, purposeful, targeted, great. I'm seeing some great answers here, making sure that there's alignment, readying students for grade level instruction, just-in-time supports, all concepts and things that I'm happy to see. Especially glad to not see language around just moving faster, right? So as you've likely heard or read in the roadmap, acceleration is not about going through the curriculum at a faster pace. It's about providing students that just-in-time instruction that will scaffold them into grade level content. So in other words, if a student hasn't mastered the earlier skills that are required to complete a grade appropriate assignment, the student receives just-in-time support, giving the student just the right amount of help to move forward right when they need that support through scaffolding and other coordinated interventions. As we know, remediation, on the other hand, is putting students in below grade level content to fill in all of their previous gaps in a way that is less intentional at moving students quickly into grade level content. So the typical approach to remediation, which is providing work better suited for earlier grades, it really won't come close to catching students up and will likely just compound the issues of opportunity and achievement gaps. So in TNTP's recent study of the opportunity myth, we found that this approach of remediation, though it can often be well-intentioned, it practically guarantees that students will lose more academic ground, and it also reinforces misguided beliefs that some students can't do grade level work. The students that are stuck in this vicious cycle are, as we know, disproportionately our most vulnerable students, students of color, students from low-income families with special needs or learning English. So in other words, doubling down on current strategies for catching students up will again only widen the gaps that they're experiencing. We're going to unpack this concept a little bit more by looking at what we've learned from the opportunity myth. So even before school closures, we know that students often didn't have access to grade level assignments, especially some of the student groups I just mentioned a moment ago. When we conducted the research in the opportunity myth, we looked at more than 5,000 assignments and 20,000 pieces of student work from 5 districts across the country. And we saw that students often were not even presented or, provided with the opportunity to attempt, let alone have access to grade level tasks. In fact, only about a quarter of assignments gave students the chance to meet the demands of grade level standards in the 5 districts that we studied. So that 54 percentage point gap is full of assignments that do not give kids a chance to meet the demands of the standards. That means students are getting good grades in some cases and succeeding on content that is not building that ladder to post-secondary success. Again, that's not because students couldn't successfully engage in standards-aligned assignments. Across our sample, when students were given a chance to try grade level work, they rose to the bar of their grade level standards more than half of the time. This was true across demographic groups that I mentioned earlier, and we could see that in all groups, students can and do meet the bar when we give them a chance and when they're receiving appropriate supports. Just to illustrate this a bit further, this was especially true for students who were below grade level. So students who started the year behind grew significantly more when they had access to grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and teachers with high expectations. So again, along with those other resources like high expectations and strong instruction, students who started the year behind made the most academic progress, the equivalent of 7.3 more months of learning when they had access to grade appropriate assignments versus when they didn't. So we have a statement here that pretty much summarizes some of these ideas I've just been sharing with you. And I'm actually gonna ask my colleague, Katie Buckland, if you could read the 2 white paragraphs of text on the slide for the group. Thank you.
In most classrooms, students spent far too much time on content that was not appropriate for their grade. In a single school year, the average student spends about 530 hours of the approximately 720 hours in their core classes on assignments that are not grade appropriate.
Great, thanks, Katie. So right now we're going to go into breakout groups to just touch base with one another on how some of these findings that I've just shared or other ideas, around acceleration, how these findings affirm, challenge, or expand how you approached unfinished learning. And this is also a good time to think about how you share these messages or ideas with educators in your school who may still be a bit resistant or more, let's say, remediation minded teachers, in a sense, thinking they need to fill in all prior content before moving on to grade level content. So how does this information affirm, challenge, or expand your approach? And how might you translate this information to your own school setting? So we're going to go out to breakout groups for about 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and share how. So for those of you who are still in the main room, you should hopefully have received a link to join a breakout room to discuss what we've been learning so far. Great. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for letting that timer bring you back. I just like to take 1 minute to share out some takeaways. If you'd like, please go ahead and share in the chat some ideas you may have shared. And also feel free to come off of mute and share with the whole group as well. We'd love to hear from you.
So Irene, one of the things that we talked about that I feel like for me keeps coming up is I think teachers like really understand like the research behind all of this acceleration piece. Like, and when it came out, like I was like, oh, like hit the nail on the head. Like it makes total sense. The piece I think that is difficult for teachers who've been teaching in like a remedial way for years and years is how do I do this acceleration piece? How do I provide the just-in-time supports? It's a whole different facet of planning that I don't think they're familiar with. And I think that's the piece that I think we need to give our teachers like professional development and support on.
Absolutely. Thanks for calling that out, Stacy. And hopefully in seeing the scope and sequence for this learning, we know it's a drop-in series, but we really hope to see you all back for those sessions that we're going to do around scaffolding and figuring out that just-in-time support. We're going to be talking a bit about that today. First, we want to make sure that we're putting the right assignments in front of kids, and then we're going to dive a lot more deeply into some of those foundational strategies, Stacy, that we're hearing teachers needing around scaffolding, building schema, language, vocabulary development. So I think absolutely right, spot on. That's what we've been hearing. So, and I see that seems to have been a trend in our rooms as well. So thanks for lifting that up, Stacey. I think with that, we're going to move into our first larger chunk of new learning for today. So in this section, we will walk through a very small portion of an assignment review protocol that you and your teams can use to determine if the assignments that are being put in front of kids are meeting grade level expectations. So really quick, we're going to do some reflecting on the math curricula we're currently using. So in the chat, if you could just share what curricula is being used at your school and if you believe it's being used with fidelity. So just the title of the curricula that's being used in math and how it's being used. Is it being used with fidelity? Meaning as intended. So it's seeing a little bit of trends that we're in our first year. So it's understood if, you know, fidelity is something we're working towards. So this is actually very good timing for this type of learning that we're about to do. And, you know, the reason we ask this is that many schools and districts, they have adopted curricula that's fully aligned to the standards. However, that does not necessarily mean that it's being used in the manner that it's intended to be used. So for example, a teacher using Eureka Math may favor or prioritize parts of a lesson that focus on fluency, while placing less time and importance on providing students with access to the more challenging parts of the lesson, like a story problem or the rich analytical tasks that are also part of the curriculum. Especially when we're in that first implementation year, we also see kind of a mix of old curriculum and new curriculum. So it's something this task can help us pay a little bit more closer attention to. And then that last question there is really just a self-reflection. When you lead or participate in professional development that focuses on math, how does your staff engage? And we ask for you to reflect on this because we know that sometimes participants will shy away from Math PD. They might feel that they don't bring a certain level of expertise to the training, and that can feel uncomfortable. And who wants to feel uncomfortable most of the time? Most of us learned math in a very different way, focusing on that rote memorization format, and may not feel we have that depth of expertise. So the tool we're going to use today is really designed to support educators with any level of expertise to evaluate grade appropriateness of assignment and also to grow their skills in that area. So if you got a chance to see the pre-work, it's okay if you didn't. We'll be looking at this tool quite a bit. But if you had a chance to take a look at the math task analysis tool, you'll have seen that it's quite extensive. So the full process of using this tool takes about 30 to 35 minutes. And the purpose of using the tool is to engage in professional learning that will lead educators to internalizing the characteristics of grade appropriate assignments. This protocol isn't something that you would use every time you plan a lesson. Instead, it's something that you may use for long-term planning, collaborative planning sessions, or a lot of the time we see it used during PLCs to deepen understanding of grade level standards, to better understand your curriculum, and what grade level assignments should look like for a specific grade level. In my experience, this process has also helped to inform how I scaffold lessons without removing the rigor of the lesson. It's also an important protocol to use, even if you are already starting with high quality, highly rated curriculum based on the Curate Registry. Again, how we plan and execute our lessons, we can still remove that intended level of rigor. And this exercise can support you and your teams with understanding why your materials are high quality, how they're intended to be used, and that can translate to stronger instruction. So right now we're going to take the next couple of minutes, about 3 minutes, to just reorient ourselves to the task analysis tool. And then we'll come back together. So take a couple minutes to just read that tool, which you can find linked in the handout. I'm sorry, not linked, it's embedded in the handout. All right, so hopefully you've gotten a chance to at least see the first 2 sections and orient yourselves a bit to the tool. Again, we encourage you to go back and review it more thoroughly. But for today, we're going to keep moving. With that said, I know some of you may want to refer back to previous slides. So if you haven't seen already, this slide deck is linked in the handout, so you can open it to follow along. So as you likely noticed, the tool itself is organized into 4 sections: content, practice, relevance, and student performance. And we're going to walk through the content section and its descriptors today. We're focusing on only the content section because that is the most foundational element of the tool and will give you a good idea or give teachers a good idea as well about whether or not they're starting with grade appropriate content. In a sense, this first section is functions almost as a gatekeeper. If the assignment does not meet or rate highly in this section, then we already know that it's not providing the opportunity for grade appropriate work and learning. So as you begin to analyze this section, there are a variety of tools that will be very useful to support you and the teachers you work with going through and assessing the different indicators. I'll reference several of them today, but they are also linked in the handout. So starting with the first one, we have the Common Core Standards app or the DESI Math Framework. And the importance of these resources is that you are beginning your task analysis by starting with the actual language of the standard. I know sometimes it can be abbreviated in curricula or it can have a little bit different wording. What's really important is that we're starting with the full language of the standard so that we can determine if the task is appropriately addressing it. The next document is called the progressions document, and this helps us to determine if the content of the lesson is appropriately addressing the aspect of rigor that's called for by the standard. And we'll get a little bit more into what we mean by aspect of rigor in a moment. The third resource is the focus documents. And these documents help us to determine if the content of the lesson ties to the major, supporting, or additional work of the grade. And then the last one we're going to reference today is the DESI Standards Navigator. So this resource is very useful in helping us to understand the previous and future concepts that a lesson or task could explicitly connect to. When it comes to learning acceleration, this tool is critical to how we're planning and looking at assignments to determine how the learning is connected and what support students will need. So let's go back to the tool and we're looking again just at the content section in the analysis tool, so that first section. So to rate the content section, we have to consider 2 indicators. First, we need to determine whether the assignment targets a grade level standard. Then we need to determine if they target grade level standards in an appropriate way. And to do this, we look at those 3 highlighted areas known as focus, coherence, and rigor. So let's start with that first item around standards. So to answer this first question in the content section, or to rate this indicator, we want to consider whether the task is only comprised of grade level standards, or if the standards, if there are standards from other grade levels, or even non-grade level standards also present. So when there are multiple skills addressed in one assignment, we need to intentionally align every single question to the appropriate standard to determine what % of the questions are aligned to the grade level standards before we can rate this question. So we're not just looking at it as a whole to see if a standard is addressed, but we're looking to see if what each individual question, what standard it's addressing. So for example, let's say we have an assignment where 2 grade levels are present. Let's say we have an 8th grade task where we have 6 questions that are from 7th grade and 4 that are from 8th grade. We would want to pay special attention to what percentage of time is being spent on grade level questions to appropriately rate this assignment. So to meet this first indicator, all questions would need to be on grade level to mark yes. However, in our example, we have some that are 7th and 8th grade. So we would mark this as partially, and then we would continue and move on. If there was no alignment, then this assignment would rate as a 0, as in 0 opportunity for grade level learning. Just pause there for a little processing. So once we've identified the standards and the standards addressed in the assignment, we then need to determine if the questions and tasks themselves reach the depth of the grade level standard and what it's asking for. So for math, this is defined by the 3 shifts in instruction required to support students with mastering the skills of the standards for math. So we have focus, coherence, and rigor. And you will consider sub-questions aligned to each of these shifts to determine your final rating for this indicator. So let's begin with focus. And just to address the graphic on the slide, this is an example of one of the focus documents from Student Achievement Partners. Again, you have the link in your handout. And these documents help us to see what is the major work, the supporting work, or the additional work of the grade level. So what is essentially the main topic that's focused on for that particular grade level. So again, the first question asks whether or not the assignment includes grade appropriate numbers, number types, and representations that align to the grade level standard. The reason this is important is because sometimes we may select a task that appears to be on grade level, but sometimes the numbers or number types or representations are actually not aligned to the demand of the standard. So for example, in 6th grade geometry, they specifically call for students to use fractions to find volume. So if you were to give a student an assignment to find volume, but they were using whole numbers instead of fractions, that would not be considered as on grade level, given the number types. We also want to pay attention. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you have to advance the slide.
Do you see the focus by grade level?
No, I see the standards analysis still.
Oh. What do you see now?
Same. I think it's stuck.
I think it's frozen. Let me, I'm so sorry. Let me reshare.
Sorry about that, everyone. And sorry to interrupt, Irene. I just wanted to make sure everyone could see.
Oh no, I saw some faces that looked a little confused. So I'm glad you paused. Let's see, let's reshare. Sorry about this, everyone. I really appreciate your patience. So I think we're going to, oh, now I have no windows with anyone. Tabitha, are you still there?
I shared my screen.
Thank you. I actually cannot see anyone or anything. My Zoom window has disappeared. So I actually think I'm going to need to log out, having major technical difficulties. Oh.
Sorry about this. I've been having Zoom troubles as well. So I totally get it. I think we left off with numbers and number types.
Yes. Are people able to see the screen with the focus document? Yes.
I'm getting some nods. I can, sorry, you can't see Zoom faces. I can see people. I'm getting all the
Okay.
nods. I'm getting a thumbs up here and there.
So we'll continue from here. And again, you have the slide deck. Should it disappear, we will try to get it back on. But I can't see you, but as long as you can hear me, I think we're okay. Tabitha will be my eyes for right now. So again, I'm so sorry. I appreciate you all your patience with this. But again, we were talking about number types and representations. So in addition to paying attention to the number types, we want to pay attention to the representations being asked for. So for example, there are standards that call for equations, number sentences, or students representing pictorially. We want to analyze the assignments we put in front of students to look at the representations and number types and make sure that they're aligned again to the targeted grade level standard. Some standards will specify representations and number types and others may not. If this is the case, it's fine to skip this sub question. However, if you find that it's necessary to evaluate in the case of number types, we can consider looking at other resource documents, such as the progressions, another one we've shared with you all, to get an idea of what is appropriate across that particular grade level. So essentially, we're primarily looking for places where an assignment misses an opportunity to use grade appropriate and standard dependent representations and number types. Finally, one question that's important to consider globally, but not for the purposes of rating an individual assignment, is whether or not the content of the assignment aligns to the major, supporting, or additional work of the grade. We really want to make sure students are spending the majority of their time on the major work of the grade. Tabitha, can you advance, please? So let's move on to coherence. So the key with coherence, the second part of that second question, is we want to determine does the math connect and make sense within the assignment if there are multiple problems or tasks. So in the coherence sub-question, it's where we more deeply consider whether or not the content you see in the assignment makes a coherent connection between major, supporting, and additional work at that grade level, or if the assignment contains questions or tasks that align to below grade level standards, if those questions are coherently aligned to the grade level content. So we want to understand how the learning is connected to what they are learning in the grade and beyond. Is it coherent? Is it necessary to go back to certain standards, and does it all align in a coherent way? Again, when it comes to learning acceleration, this indicator becomes even more important to evaluate as we determine what are the prerequisite standards a student may need additional support with in order to access the grade level content. So this sub-question is only at play if more than one standard is addressed in the assignment. Again, you will consult the focus documents, the navigator tool, and that's what you see on your screen, an example of, as well as the progression documents to understand coherence within and across the grade level. And lastly, we have rigor. So we want to consider the aspect of rigor called for by the targeted standards, and the aspect of rigor of that, and that the aspect of rigor of that assignment, what it actually addresses. So just to restate, we're looking for a match between the two, the aspect of rigor called for by the standard and the aspect of rigor that the assignment actually addresses. So when we say aspect of rigor, we're talking about the three areas that you see depicted in the image. So some standards may call for procedural fluency, where students are asked to demonstrate speed and accuracy. And there are certain standards that are asking students to develop more of a conceptual understanding and awareness. So for example, let's say in a third grade standard, multiplication is called out. It might mean that students are being asked to think about the relationships between numbers when we multiply and what effect that has on the product. However, if the task is asking students to practice their timetables, we can see that that aspect of rigor between the task and the standard is not aligned. So recognize that that is a lot of information, especially if it's new. But again, this is just the first portion of the task analysis tool, where we want to see if the content being addressed really is aligned to the standards of the grade level. And that's our kind of like our gatekeeper standard to moving on with the task. So let's take a look at an example together. So we're going to practice using the tool to write the content section for just one assignment. And this assignment, it's embedded in your handout, as well as a small excerpt of the content portion of the tool. It's right there, so you don't need to go back and forth. So I'm going to give everyone just a moment to locate the assignment, make sure you have found it before we move on. Let's see if I can get this back open. So for this assignment, hopefully you have located. If not, just please ask in the chat and one of my co-facilitators can support you. Right now, we're going to spend about 5 minutes working independently to answer those questions. So you're going to consult the assignment, and remember that first question asks for what standards are addressed. I'm going to go ahead and give you the standard for the sake of time. It's a 6th grade standard, and you see it there in blue. Find the area of right triangles and so forth. I also encourage you to go into the standards navigator to see what other standards might align to this task once you get to the question around coherence. So this is a chance to use the task analysis tool, as well as a little bit of practice with some of those linked tools we have just gone over. So after you've had about 5 minutes to contemplate the answers to those questions yourselves, we'll go into breakout groups, and we are trying to determine if this assignment is aligned to the grade level standard. Is it weakly aligned, or is it not aligned at all? So are there any questions before we go into breakouts?
Irene, could you put the assignment link in the chat box, please?
Yes, so Margaret is probably going to paste the link to the note catcher right now, if I could see. And in the note catcher, if you scroll down, you will see the assignment. And so I hope that helps. Right now, it's 50 after the hour. We're going to take about 5 minutes to just independently work, and then we'll go into breakouts. And to my team, I'm going to go ahead and sign out and see if I can sign back in. And if I'm not back in 5 minutes, please let's transition to breakouts.
Irene, did you make it back?
Yes, I am on here, hopefully to stay. And thank you all for engaging in that exercise. We're now going to go into breakout groups to share out some of our findings, what we found. I noticed we have a lot of people off of video, but this is a really great time to come back on video to work with your breakout groups, definitely to make it more interactive and engaging. So we'll go into breakouts for the next few minutes just to share our rating and reasoning, and then we'll come back to debrief together.
I'm going to hand the mic over to Tabitha, who mentioned that Kristen Harmon, your group had some interesting discussion. So Tabitha, I'm not sure if you want to share anything else there, if we're ready to hear from Kristen directly.
Sorry, I jumped into that group really last minute and also didn't warn them that I was gonna ask them to share. So Kristen or anyone who wants to jump in, would love to hear from you. Thought your rating was interesting, and I think the group would benefit from hearing what you have to say. And I only remembered Kristen's name because our last names are so similar, and I forget the names of the other people in the group, but anyone's welcome to share.
No, I can jump in. I mean, we had just, again, we looked at the assignment, we looked at the standard, and just in terms of the expectations of the standard, or even just, on the surface level around finding area of a right triangle, special quadrilateral polygons, all that the students were being asked to do was to find the area of the rectangle. And there was no composing, no decomposing, so it seemed very low level. and just did not seem to hit the grade level standard.
Great, thanks for that, Kristen. You definitely hit on a lot of the points we were looking for, especially around rigor and what's being asked of students. Anyone else, any differing opinions or additional findings as you went through the task?
Hi, I'm sorry. This is Tracy Curley. I'm
Great.
not on video because
No
I'm.
problem.
Oh, hello.
Yep. Hi, Tracy.
Okay,
No
sorry. So I'm
problem.
not in the office and I'm not on video. I'm home with my children, and so I think the one thing that struck me was it almost felt so far removed from the standard, like like such an easy thing to say, like, no, this isn't this isn't well aligned, that I almost wished that it had been it had been an example that was like a little bit more closely aligned, where it didn't pop out at you like, no, this is a definite no. So it's just more commentary than any kind of additional rating information.
Great, thanks, Tracy. We appreciate definitely that feedback, and we have something for you to help answer that question and that need. So with that, if there are any other comments, we'd love to hear, and if not, we're going to keep going. Great. So just as many of you have pointed out in your breakout groups and here, this assignment is weekly aligned to the standard. And as you've probably noticed, it's more closely aligned to a fourth grade level standard. Let's put up some of the reasoning there. And Kristen has definitely called out many of these points here in terms of the focus and the types of shapes in the assignments that students are being asked to use. They're more closely aligned with the fourth grade standard. In terms of coherence, this does not address the major work of the grade level. And again, these are all things that you are not expected to know and be an expert in, but there are resources there for you to support you with determining this and deepening your understanding. And then finally, again, with rigor, this assignment, it doesn't focus on conceptual understanding, which is an essential aspect of the standard, as it says there. And just as it was called out, the standard calls for students to find the area of a shape by composing it into rectangles and decomposing it into triangles and other shapes. But that's not what we're seeing being asked of students. Instead, it's reinforcing more procedural skills. So hopefully these are conclusions that you came to within your own analysis and have been doing some thinking about how this might look for teachers in your school. And to address Tracy's comment about wanting to see more examples of what it would look like if it was aligned or partially aligned, at TNTP, we have this student work library where you can find examples of aligned, strongly aligned, or weakly aligned student tasks for every grade level in math and ELA, so that your teachers can see other exemplars of how you would engage with this tool and in this type of exercise, along with, of course, practicing it with your own curriculum. So definitely encourage everyone to take a look at the student work library to bring this practice back to your school. And with that, I'm going to transition it to Tabitha to guide us through our final question there.
So we are just checking on our objectives really quickly. Now that we've looked at number one, why is it important to provide grade appropriate assignments? Number two, how do we figure out if we're giving kids the opportunity to do grade level assignments? Now we're going to transition into thinking about how we actually identify the most critical prerequisite content so students can have access on their tier 1 grade level assignment. So you've probably participated in conversations about accelerated learning before. I think for most of us, it's not our first time in one of these PDs, or maybe you've read the roadmap. So you know the importance of planning for scaffolds and making sure that students have access to tier 1. Before you actually plan scaffolds, you have to do this prerequisite step, which is to identify the most critical prerequisite content that students will need to access that tier 1 instruction. And that's what makes your scaffold really focused and really appropriate for the task at hand and for the standard that students are working on. And it prevents you from like accidentally lowering the rigor by applying a scaffold that might not be the right fit. So what we're going to do today is we're going to practice identifying those prerequisite standards so we can make sure to effectively plan for supporting students and give them access to tier 1 instruction, and be sure not to remediate. So I like this graphic. We can advance so the graphic shows up. I think it animates. Yeah, okay. Strange animation sequence. Okay, we're good. Got the last arrow. So saying that you accelerate learning means that your system, all of your schools and all of the teachers in your schools are leaning into these 3 key principles. So we'll talk quickly about each one before we actually get some practice with it. The first is they have to have a really strong understanding of grade level instruction. They need to know what it looks like in practice, the content that's covered, the best materials to use. And I actually heard someone earlier today who was saying, you know, my district, we're starting a new curriculum and at the same time focusing on learning acceleration. So it's just a lot. Those 2 things are actually the same. Having high quality instructional materials is learning acceleration. And so having really strong materials are going to help your teachers understand what strong instruction looks like, what grade level instruction looks like. So that's like step 1. So you're actually almost there. The next part is diagnosing student understanding of these prerequisite concepts and skills. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. It's really important that we're not talking about, we want to emphasize, we're not talking about these like big formal diagnostics. I know sometimes like we'll do a battery assessment at the beginning of the year. Diagnosing could be informal. It could be circulating in the classroom, looking at student work and kind of taking note of what students are struggling with and what prerequisite standards might not be as strong, where they might need a little bit of scaffolding. And lastly, taking action. This is planning for and executing really effective instructional practices. So we're pairing the knowledge that we have of students and what their strengths are and what their areas of growth. And we're pairing that with the educator's knowledge of high quality grade level content. And that's going to help us devise and execute these really great scaffolds and systems of support for all students. We can go on. All right, another fun animation slide. So this is a potential snapshot of how a learning accelerated driven teacher would go about adopting that approach this year. So we can see an acceleration minded teacher moves from understanding his or her content or their content to diagnosing students using that prerequisite content as the base of that assessment. And then once they have that data, they can use it to make that whole class decision, small group decision, or individual student decision, and make those year-long unit or lesson level adjustments. And that will really depend on, you know, what we're looking at. And moreover, I think that information is super useful for those systems of support, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And so we'll focus on how to give access to students who need tier 1 access. All students need tier 1 access, but that's what we're focusing on today. We will have later sessions on other tiers and the systems of support. So let me see if there's another opportunity to explain a slide. Can we actually go back? Because I think this slide's a little bit confusing. So here's the deal. You can see up top, these are all the prerequisite standards. If we're looking at a 5th grade example for the 5th grade NBT standards, you have 4 NBT 1 and 4 NF 5 and so on, those NBT and NF standards. The teacher is kind of like, I think these standards are somewhat relevant to this 5 NBT unit. And so I'm going to diagnose, you can see on the bottom left, I'm going to diagnose them at the start. I'm going to see how students are doing, and then I'm going to align and adjust my plan. And you can see in take action, the teacher has not gone to reteach all of the red and green standards. They said, okay, I'm going to spend a day on, you know, this green section on the NBT standards from 4th grade, and that's going to help my students access grade level instruction, and that's what that D symbolizes. So I like to explain that slide because there's a lot of color. It's a lot of stuff going on here, but that's generally what we mean by learning acceleration at the unit level. So now we can go on to the next slide. We're going to dig into an example. It's a 5th grade math example. I actually taught 5th grade math when I taught, so I really enjoy 5th grade math. I get really jazzed about it. It is the bridge builder for deepening conceptual understanding of fractions, as well as operations and algebraic thinking. And it's really essential for some of the things that students have to do in grade 6. It's kind of like a nice wrap up year. I really enjoy teaching 5th grade math. So when a teacher is looking across their scope and sequence for the 5th grade year, they're going to see that to access the concepts that students cover in 5th grade, teachers have to really explore students' ability to in their understandings from concept skills and academic language that are associated with multiplication and division of whole numbers and fractions with multi-digit numbers. So we can look a little bit closer at that. Notice these standards covered in Unit 1. I don't know how familiar we all are with the 5th grade standards, but these are like understanding that a digit to the left or right is 10 times more, 10 times less, and then all operations, but it's really focused on conceptual understanding, approaching fluency. So that's what these standards are. And we will talk a little bit more about, go on to the next slide. Thanks, Margaret. We'll talk a little bit more about this map here and the related prior standards. So I'm just going to enlarge my screen for a sec. So you can see some of the 4th grade standards that are identified here. And this is also in your handout. I know this font is super small. So on the left-hand side, we have the related prior grade standards. And we're also looking at the same grade standards as well. If we're teaching NBT 1, we're looking at the other NBT standards as well that are related. So take a look at this, and based on these prior standards and like your general understanding of being like math people in schools working with kids, let's talk about some things that students may need support with in order to get access to this work. So the standard here is recognize that in a multi-digit number, including decimals, a digit in any place represents 10 times as much as it represents in the place to its right, and then vice versa for to its left. So what kind of knowledge and skills do students need from 4th grade in order to get access to that standard? And you can either put your name in the chat to share out, or I might ask you to unmute, I might call on you.
One thing that I would,
Sorry, Katie, was that Ron or Tim? I know there's a Tim who is actually Ron.
oh, great.
Or vice versa.
Maybe Ron.
All right, Katie, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say they would need to know what place value, when a digit is in a certain place, what that place value is. They would just need to be fluent with their knowledge of place value.
Absolutely. Laura, did you want to add on?
There's mention of, they would need to know their times tables. They would need to know any place represents 10 times as much.
Yeah, they have to understand that actual academic vocabulary, right? Which it can be really challenging. Thank you.
They would definitely have to know their right from their left.
Also true. Also true. Any change to peers? Anyone else want to jump in, add anything else on? Using some wait time.
I think similar to knowing what times means, knowing what 1/10 of something is. would be important.
Yep, for sure. All right. So yeah, all in all, there are 6 standards from prior grades that relate to what students are covering in this unit. And knowledge of how those standards cohere together is really imperative when planning these just-in-time scaffold. And at this point, remember, it doesn't mean that the teacher is gonna reteach all of these related concepts, right? We're gonna pick the most important ones. We're gonna look at what students know and don't know, and we're gonna pick the most important, what they really need to get access to content quickly. So we can move along. I just want to point out for your reference that we're pulling from the Standards Navigator. I'm sure you've seen this resource before. I hope you have. It's a very great tool for math and all subjects where you can track back standards. You can start with a 5th grade standard like we just did and track back to like 4th and beyond, and also go in the other direction. So just wanted to point your attention to that, because we're actually going to now go into a breakout room and practice doing this with another standard and another prerequisite standard situation. Sorry, I'm jumbling my words. So this one is a 4th grade standard. We want to think about which standards are prerequisite skills and content for this specific standard. And I'll actually ask Margaret to go ahead and read that standard out loud for me, please.
Understand a fraction. Understand a fraction AB as a multiple of 1B. For example, use a visual fraction model to represent 5/4 as the product 5 times 1/4, recording the conclusion by the equation 5/4 equals 5 times 1/4.
Yeah, that A over B is kind of hard to say because it's hard to say as a fraction when it's letters. Yeah, it's a tough one. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So talk about these prerequisite skills and content for this one. And based on those standards, what are the critical pieces of knowledge and skills that will need to be diagnosed? And how might you actually diagnose that unfinished learning? So we're going to hop into breakouts for a little bit. We'll put these questions in the chat just in case you don't have your handout in front of you. And we will be sending you into breakouts shortly. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and chat at TNT here.
Are you moving people, Margaret? Oh, okay. I see Tracy's still alone. Okay. There we go.
Irene, for some reason, I don't see you as a.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We had a very rich discussion in my group, and we had a nice mix of people with a math background, people with not so much a math background. And just want to reiterate, this is a space for everyone to ask and answer questions. We have experts in the room who can really illuminate some of these concepts and bring them to life and bring up examples. So do not be shy. I have volunteered someone in my group to start us off. She is a math person, so she's a good person to get us started, but also want to invite everyone to chime in after Kristen. So I'll pass the mic to Kristen. What was your answer to some of these questions?
So we talked about, or I guess I had said that, I felt like this particular standard provided a great opportunity for that idea of acceleration. Just where as a grade 3 standard with unit fractions, and this part of this standard focused on the use of unit fractions for multiplication. It's a great way to bring that into the lesson without stopping everything, teaching unit fractions. So I just felt like this is a good example, or I'm thinking it'll be a good example to use with staff to help them better understand what acceleration looks like. But I think, in terms of those prerequisite skills, or, where are students with unit fractions, the array model, like how can they, what's their background, how do we build that in, and looking for understanding around that. Can students multiply whole numbers? How do we get them to understand that this is just an extension of that?
Yep, absolutely. I heard arrays. I also think tape diagrams are really useful with this standard. Anyone else want to have anything to share about prerequisite knowledge and skills? And I would love to hear from someone who hasn't shared yet, maybe Stephanie or Matt or Yvonne. No pressure. Let's advance the slide. Just one. So we've just done oh yeah. Ooh, yeah, that one. We've done a little bit of this planning. So let's talk a little bit about who should be at your school involved in doing this type of work, in, maybe participating in a PD like this in your school or in your district, depending on where you sit. And what's really required to invest all educators in this approach. So where do you see yourself kind of bringing this alive at your school? And all of my Zoom boxes are black for some reason. I can't see any faces. So I'm really counting on you to volunteer.
As an administrator, I absolutely would be interested in getting teacher voice on, because I know that teachers are concerned about the amount of what used to be called remediation work that they often have to face. So I think it would be a relief to teachers to train them to develop the skill of acceleration, because it would take the pressure off of them to go so far back. And now that the research is showing that kids don't benefit from that, I think that'll be a huge shift in messaging. And then to follow that up with this training, I think would be really valuable, and kids would benefit.
I totally agree. And it's if you're thinking about this at the classroom level, doing acceleration instead of remediation looks like, launching it with a really fun discussion, explaining to kids hey, you're going to get really good at dividing things into equal parts and multiplying things. You already know this, we're just building on it. And just practicing that most critical gap only, 1 or 2 lessons or 1 or 2 mini lessons, or small group instruction. It's so much easier than trying to reteach the whole prior grade. And so once teachers get the swing of it, it is going to feel a lot easier and a lot better. And I'm just pausing intentionally in case anyone else wants to add on. And again, my Zoom boxes are all black, so I can't see your face, and I'm really counting on volunteers. I see Stephanie, Matt, and Tracy are off mute if anyone wants to share. Go ahead.
Oh, I can share. It's Stephanie. I was speaking in my group around going to a professional development in one of our elementary schools just recently, focused on the vertical progression of this particular standard that you called out. And so she had all of her K-5 math educators in the room, and they were looking at each one of the prerequisite standards, starting at the very young grades, talking about what are the knowledge and skills that kids need to have in order to master that standard at that grade, and then talked about how the standard was built upon in the next grade, which really made good sense as far as what's happening right now in our district. We just adopted illustrative math K-5, and there are diagnostics built in. And so it did support teachers in better understanding the purpose of those diagnostics and why they're really critical to learning acceleration in our buildings.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And also just gonna really highlight one more time the importance of high quality instructional materials, right? You're fully set up now to implement those diagnostics and start learning acceleration because you have that there. So thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. And I believe Tracy and Matt also came off mute, so I'm just going to pause in case there's something you still want to share.
No,
So
I
I
just, oh, no, go on, go on. I have nothing to say but echoing others.
I was actually just going to say that I work with Stephanie, and I was just going to offer something similar to what she said in a much more general sense of the kind of work that we're doing in terms of our, using assessment previews to get a good, sense of what students are expected to do in a unit of study, and then examining those prerequisite standards to provide just-in-time intervention. But Steph had a very pointed example of work that she observed at the school level. So yeah, she said it all.
All right, thanks for sharing. And we're gonna move along. So centering math instruction on these acceleration and just-in-time practices, it means that we all embrace these things on this slide. So we're using formative data, we're providing just-in-time instruction with scaffolds, we're tracing the learning progression, which is I think what we've just talked about. It's so important to look at math coherently as it progresses through the years. We're centering whatever aspect of rigor is appropriate, and we are providing new experience for students to engage with math. We're not just reteaching them what they previously didn't master. So I'll give you a second just to read and internalize that slide, because I know there's a lot of words on there, and then we're going to move on to the last phase of our time together today. All right, I'm notoriously not great at estimating read time, but I'm assuming everyone got the chance to skim and you have the slides in your notes as well. So we're going to move along. We've talked about providing grade appropriate assignments. We've talked about making sure we can evaluate assignments to see if they're grade level. We've talked about how to identify the most important prerequisite skills. And if we know all of that, that's great, but ultimately it doesn't matter unless we can make change in our schools for students in classrooms. So I think most of those people on this call are systems or school leaders. So we're going to spend some time just talking about what we can do to kind of make this come alive. So right now, take a second and independently reflect on what we've learned so far. How close or how far away is your school or district from this vision? And how do you know? That's really important. We want to base this in evidence. How do you know where you are? And what might a school have to have in place for this kind of accelerated strong instruction to take place? Think about, I think we've talked about curriculum, so that's a freebie. We know that one. But what kind of structures for PD? What kind of observation protocols? I want you to think through all of those things. What has to be in place in order to make this kind of accelerated learning happen? So take a minute just to think to yourself. I'm going to put myself on mute and feel free to jot down some notes. All right. You'll have more time to consider and think. I want to give you a little bit of a frame for your thinking. So let's move to the next slide and think about the levers as a leader that you have in your school. Sorry, I think I got a question about breakout rooms. I think we should just do random breakout rooms. So if you're the breakout room person, just make them random. The next slide. So let's think about this. So one thing we can do is set expectations. I think some of you have already done this. I think there's always opportunity to reiterate expectations of adults and students regarding learning acceleration, especially if you're seeing things that are a little bit off track. It's nice to make that correction early in the year, have that conversation. The second thing is tools. I think here's a good spot to talk about curriculum again. We've already talked about it so much, but it is so important. That's a tool that adults and students need to meet the expectation that we're setting around learning acceleration. I think it's also important to think about other tools that might be needed, and I'll let you talk about that more in your groups. Thirdly, what support or development do adults or students need to implement this system, to implement learning acceleration? Consider the PD, the training, They might need a budget for manipulatives. They might need a variety of things, and you might need to ask them. So what might they need? And lastly, what is the time that you have? How can you adjust the time that you have to provide folks the opportunity to learn and refine their implementation of this practice? And these are the kind of levers we think about. These levers are leader levers that hopefully influence teacher behaviors and change student outcomes. And so this slide is in pretty much all of our PDs because, like I said, it's not, if you don't spread the idea and make it come alive in your district, it doesn't matter how, well articulated your vision is or any of that, because like the most important thing is that it matters for students. So these are the levers we have to pull to actually change student outcomes. So we'll spend a little bit of time now just chatting to discuss these actual levers that we have. I think the original plan was to break up by school level, but we have a really small group. So let's just break into 2 random groups. And you're thinking about the levers that you have and how you can make this come alive at your school. I think we are all set as long as everyone has access to the questions. So whenever. Kara, you want to join your breakout room?
We were discussing some of the challenges or the preconceived notions that some of the teachers had regarding learning acceleration when it was first introduced to them, and transitioning from a remediated approach, and how that can cause stress and the importance of change management around that. And then I believe, I'm not sure who was sharing about their math teacher and the middle school math teacher regarding multiplication. I'm not sure if you want to come off mute and just share that with the group before we move forward.
It was me, but I had a 6th grade math teacher who, understood that, kids needed to use the concept of multiplication for different, operations they were doing in math. They didn't know their multiplication tables, and he said, just give them calculators. They'll be able to apply, what they need with that. That's a tool they can use, and they can learn some of those, multiplication tables down the road. But he didn't feel it was important to go back to 3rd grade for them to be able to understand that you use this operation, in other ways in math.
I'm so happy you brought that up because that is one of my #1 pet peeves, is in a classroom where a kid doesn't know their multiplication tables. Like, just give them a calculator. They can still access grade level content and use the calculator until they get more fluent with those multiplication tables. And that's 100% a valid thing to do. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a great example of a scaffold and a simple thing that probably could be implemented across many classrooms in your school or district now. Anyone else want to share out from your group? Can I use some wait time here? All right, we can move along. I'm going to ask 100% of participants to select one of the following sentence starters just to reflect on today's session. Just select one. You can put it in the chat. So something you recognize, something you learned, something that surprised you, or something you want to learn more about. And, if you put 2 sentences in the chat, you definitely will get bonus points for that. But 1 is fine, but I would love to hear from every single person. I think it's important that we are all reflecting, and I want to hear what you think. Margaret, I got excited. That was our first response coming in, but it was just you repasting the prompts, but thank you. All right, we got Yvonne, the Standard Navigator. It is a great tool, and it's not just for math. If you're not familiar with that tool, you should definitely check it out. It's a great tool for Massachusetts. Yep, I recognize that we're on the right track. I love that, Tracy, because so often, you know, in these PDs, you'll realize that you're not on the right track. So it's also really important to celebrate when you are on the right track and, you know, we're taking the right steps. We have a curriculum in place. We're getting teachers prepared with scaffolds and all of that. Laura wants to learn more about identifying prerequisite standards. That is like a lifelong process. I will tell you that as like a math expert. I'm always revisiting and thinking about that. So it's like a practice you do starting any new math unit. You're like practicing looking back at those standards. So if you're getting more into math, that's a habit you should get into. And more praise for the Standards Navigator. I love that folks are getting into that. And yes, standard cohesion. Yep, coherence over time. All right. Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate that. We are going to reflect on that. It sounds like the Standards Navigator was like a really great tool. So we'll make sure to include that in the future for future participants. We also would love to have you sign up for additional sessions. Our next session is on ELA if you're interested in that. And then we'll get a little bit deeper into, you know, what learning acceleration means. Yes, Ivan, like it's a catchphrase. We need to make sure what people understand what that means. So, you know, feel free to join further sessions. We're also going to put a chat link to our survey. So we would love for you to take our survey. It's so helpful to hear from you. We have 2 of these a month for the rest of the year through May. So we will, as soon as the session ends, be in the survey looking at your responses and figuring out how we can improve sessions like this for other folks in Massachusetts in the future. So please take our survey. We really, really appreciate it. And we will stay on this Zoom until everyone else leaves, just in case anyone has a question they want to ask. And if you would like to ask your question over email, myself and Irene are available by email anytime. You're welcome to reach out to us with questions or thoughts. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for coming. And again, we'll stay on. So feel free to hop off whenever you're done with the survey or, you know, close out and then take the survey, whatever works for you. Have a great afternoon and thank you for making the time. Anyone in this group have questions we can answer while we sit on here till 5? Feel free to just come off mute anytime.
Quick question, where's the survey? Did I miss it?
It's in the chat. Margaret will send it again. Sometimes it like goes off the screen because there's a lot in the chat.